Good afternoon. I'm Eyck Academie Residency and Program Coordinator at the Eyck Academie. I'm here with the Eyck Academie Director Emily Pettick, and we are very excited and happy that we can welcome you both online and live in the room at the second event, North Sea Tales of the Academy series, which is a series of artist-led programs organized in collaboration with the Eyck Academie in Amsterdam, the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, the Netherlands, and the Sastemonian Foundation, the Academy of Fine Arts and Uni Arts in Helsinki, Finland. Just to give you a little bit of a background on this collaboration, the Jan van Eyck Academy and the Eyck Academy alternate monthly in hosting a public dialogue between its artists in residence. With this series of events, we hope to connect online and offline audiences from Helsinki, Maastricht, Amsterdam, and of course, as well as from elsewhere, everywhere else in the world. Hopefully you are there. I would now actually like to also give the word to the Jan van Eyck in Maastricht, where Director Hisham Khalidi and Curator of Public Program Bruno Almeida are present to say hello and welcome you as well.
Hi Vera, hi Emily, hi all at the Rijks, and hi Amsterdam and Helsinki here from Maastricht. I'm Hisham Khalidi, Director of Jan van Eyck Academy. Super excited about this event. I'll give the word to Bruno to say hi.
Hi everyone, my name is Bruno. Yes, very excited too. Unfortunately, we still don't have our current participants here, but for the next session we will be full house. And thanks for hosting us virtually too. And now maybe I'll pass the mic to Finland, to Marika.
Okay, hello. I'm Marika Orenius, working with art pedagogy here at the Academy of Fine Arts. We have a very nice, lovely new building, which you saw last time already, but those who are new to this series, we are kind of doing new installations in this space to make this space to work for us as a social and lecture space. I'm really looking forward to the second time to see all your presentations and take part in the QA.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maastricht and Helsinki, for tuning in. We will see more of you, I think, during the Q&A at the end of the event. But before we will start today's program, I would like to give the word to Emily Pettick to introduce it a little bit.
Thank you, Virag. Well, it's great to be broadcasting from the Eyck Academy and to be collaborating again with our international and national partners at Jan van Eyck and Uni Arts in Helsinki. And it's a nice opportunity to bring back three of our recent alumni. Virag's going to do proper introductions, but also to link to the Jan van Eyck's Nature Research Department, and also to have many of our current residents here in the room. This event, which is departing from, well, the North Sea and questions around environmental concerns, ecology, human and non-human relations, I think touches upon subjects that are very close to both Jan van Eyck, which has a focus on climate change at the moment, but also many of our artist residents in our community and us at the Eyck Academy as an organization as a whole, both as a theme, but also how we embed these questions within our practices. We have I think all three of you are in our green team, which needs new participants. So, well, that's something we'll be developing further going forwards. But yeah, I'm really happy to have a platform to offer to artists, both alumni, but also in the future current residents, to kind of connect, experiment, share their practices together. So I'm really looking forward to what you're doing today. And yeah, I want to say a thank you to Sastemonian Foundation for the support and for initiating this platform. And also thank you to the team, all the technical team here today, and to Virag for coordinating. And well, I'm very curious and excited about what's coming out of today and how we take this series forwards. Back to you, Vera.
Thank you, Emily, for the introduction. I will now carry on with introducing and welcoming the speakers of today. Of course, a very warm welcome to 3 Rijks alumni, Tanja Engelberts, Astrid Nobel, and Sheng-Wen Lo. And a special welcome and thank you to Giulia Bellinetti for being here today to moderate the conversation. Giulia is the coordinator of the Nature Research Department and the runner of the Future Materials Lab at the Jan van Eyck in Maastricht. Previously, she was coordinator of the production department at the MUCA in Antwerp, and currently she's conducting a PhD research project on the epistemic function of art institutions in the age of ecological crisis at the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis, University of Amsterdam. Welcome, Giulia. Welcome all. Lovely to have you here. And before I give you the word to introduce the artist further, I just wanted to quickly invite the audience in the room, but also online, to please feel free to participate in the conversation during the Q&A. Online, you can submit your questions via the chat. And also maybe an additional note, just to say that this event is being recorded, and also it will be possible to view later on our website and Vimeo. I think that's all for now. So I hand over to Giulia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera, for the introduction, and thank you for the Eyck Academie to hosting us in this beautiful space, which is meaningfully called the She. We're all gathered here to listen to North Sea Tales. 3 members of the North Sea collectivity has entrusted their intimate stories, fears, and dreams to these 3 artists, Tanja, Astrid, and Sheng, to share them with us, with the human audience of today. Astrid, Sheng, and Tanja has turned these non-human stories into human language in order for us to understand them. Today, you will hear one of each of these stories after the other. Please bear in mind this is not the original format when these narratives are told in the North Sea. In the North Sea, they are normally composing a polyphony, where one voice is not possible to be separated from the other ones. Because of the limitation of our cognitive and sensorial apparatus, the 3 artists had to perform another reductionist exercise in order to make these stories understandable and intangible for us. You will hear each of these stories after the other one. After each of the narrative, I will ask a brief questions to the artist, and after the third story, we will open the conversation to the public and to the audience. So now, without any further delays, I will give the word to Astrid.
Some of us were brought by a river, some of us were already at sea. We were born out of cracking, breaking, and eroding of mountains, shells, minerals, rocks. Since about half a century, alien elements have been invading our communities. These aliens, called plastic, don't like to talk, or take part in ancient rituals we call cycles. When we are in motion, they call us sediment. But now that we're resting on the bottom of the North Sea, they speak of sand. Somewhere around here used to be a fishing village. Centuries ago, we seeped and creeped inside the houses. Humans moving out of our way refer to us as White Death. And while we're recollecting these memories, we're being sucked into the belly of a boat. In motion again, not by wind or water, but by contracts, metal, a diesel motor. Despite massive movement, we are no longer spoken of as sediment. Now they call us nourishment. The boat takes us closer towards an island coast, then spits us out. After landing into shallow water, we feel like we might be covering and smothering clams. But we can't do anything about it. The current moves us even further towards the coast, and we begin having dreams of being a beach. But just before we reach the shore, we're being pulled away by another current, the Wadden Sea. She is hungry for sand. And we're thinking it looks like the purpose of all this disturbance isn't for us to be sunbathing, not even for us to be protecting the coast from the rising sea. We are tied up in a relocating and covering up damage game. We have been paid for by an oil company, but we can't help it. They still call us nourishment sometimes, but mostly we are spoken of as compensation, somewhere deep inside a strategic environmental impact assessment. And so we keep moving on as white death / sediment / nourishment / compensation. We hover above subsided soil, having a major identity crisis. Our way is blocked by dwarf eelgrass, and because they are so rare nowadays, we're happy to just lie around them. But there are so many logworms. We move through their bodies over and over. We are spiral string shit. But we notice that we feel fresh and like ourselves, like sand again. If the worms had not found us, there would have been no choice but to call us mud. We could have been transformed into concrete, glass, solar cells, microchips. These possibilities sound like a possible death to us. Now that we've become part of continuous recycling, we feel like we cannot die. We only worry a bit about the aliens among us slowing down the worms. Someday we will be small and they'll call us silt. And after that, clay. But for now we're good. When the water resides twice a day, the wormholes, the air, the water and us, we hiss. In this long stretch of hissing, we speak for ourselves.
Thank you, Astrid. This was very evocative. I really like the plurality you were able to express, the plurality of the sand collectivity. I'm curious actually to hear from you. I know we already briefly discussed about it, but if you can tell us about the moving image we were looking at while listening to the voices.
Yes, so it's on the North Sea coast near my hometown on Ameland, island north of the Netherlands. And what you see is erosion by wind. What you don't see is that on top of this dune cliff is an abandoned gas drilling location from the 60s. It's just been there. They expected a lot of oil, but there was not much, so it was just left there. And the soil underneath is very polluted. So, and it's really on the edge. The moment I'm filming there, and 3 months later, it was partly claimed by the sea. So about 4,000 cubical meters of polluted sand disappeared into the North Sea. Yeah.
Was the gas company recognizing the action they did? Or the impact they had?
No, because I wrote them. I know many other people were seeing this coming for years, because where I'm standing for that video to film, when I was a child, I was standing 4 meters higher, so it's really heavy eroding for already a long time. But I got a very nice reply from someone with a Shell email address that they were aware of the situation, watching it very carefully, and if measurements had to be taken, they would take them. Yeah, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, they said they were surprised by fastness of the erosion.
So they didn't acknowledge their, did they acknowledge their impact, or at least the role they had in like this polluted mass of sand falling into the water, and the impact of their action? Or?
No, they used sand. Like they also told me, do you know that there will be a new sand nourishment? It's also what is interesting about the sand changing role the whole time.
Yeah.
It's also used as an excuse a lot by the oil company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, I can give an example of like their latest narrative concerning sand, because recently a new permit for drilling on the mainland underneath the Wadden Sea was almost granted, but now it's still under discussion because of heavy resistance. But their narrative was, I went to an information evening to be informed. The narrative was that because of this gas drilling, the soil is dropping. And they say that the Wadden Sea is bringing in a lot of sedimentation to compensate for the dropping of the soil, and also compensating for the sea level rising, because for the Wadden Sea it's essential that sand flats and mud flats become dry during a low tide for birds to eat and for all these worms to live. Like the Wadden Sea is host to the biggest lugworm population in the world, and also millions of birds come there while migrating. So they said there won't be any environmental damage because the Wadden Sea is compensating for their damage. And they have this formula where they calculate their user space, is how they call it. It's a calculation of sea level rise minus soil subsidence and the sedimentation. So that's the narrative that they brought out during the information evening. But then I read this whole environmental impact assessment, and there is a lot of attention for sand nourishment. Then I think, what about these sand nourishments? Because these are quite damaging, but they are being done on the North Sea coast more and more often to compensate for sea level rise. But they are also used in contracts for permits for the gas company, so they can compensate for this sedimentation, because the sedimentation comes from somewhere, and it comes, like the Wadden Sea is pulling it from the North Sea, so the damage that they say the Wadden Sea is fixing for them is taking place on the other side, on the North Sea coast, which they don't mention. And therefore they have contracts for each centimeter of soil subsidence. They need to buy this much sand to make sand nourishments to actually compensate. It's also in my narrative, but this is completely hidden information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, this is very interesting because it tackles like how narratives and the relation with nature can be manipulated or can be used by the different parties involved in an ecosystem, right? So in this case, the corporations.
Yeah, they are not lying that the Wadden Sea is pulling sedimentation, but they are not saying that the pulling of sedimentation is causing damage elsewhere.
Yeah, and the manipulation, it was very interesting because it's expressed also in your videos, right? In the identity crisis of sand, in how sand is relating to itself through the different names and wordings that other people give it, right? The nourishment, compensation, and so on and so forth. But let's move to the next story, I guess, to the next non-human narrative from Sheng.
you see me, later you don't. Be here by day, also by night. Hold on to rocks in shallow waters. Live in the margins, ripped by tides. Being eco-servant as habitats and nourishments, from shellfish to whales, red, green, and brown. Being slippery, being not popular, as gross, slimy stuff, as toxic, deadly stuff. Cannot sing, have no wings, can never be cuter than furry critters. Often seen in various cuisines, often lost in ice cream, pies, and puddings. Or towards the bottom, frozen in time, trapped with sediments. On my way, becoming what?
Thank you, Sheng. This was very evocative too, and I feel there was a melancholic atmosphere in these videos. I wonder if you want to share with us your experience of mediating between kelp, the non-human, and the human realm, and also how you as an artist believe that art or art practices can become ethical tools to relate to other realms in a non-anthropocentric way, and if you think they can open up ways of knowledge where knowledge can become a catalyst of care for the non-human and other species.
For me, I can relate to kelp as a person. So the script kind of intermingled my life and that of the kelps. As I am an expat trying to explore my life in Europe, and also some of the naturally occurring kelps in the North Sea or around Netherlands are actually introduced species or exotic species with debatable origins. But how can it know? So for kelp and I, the idea of home sometimes become blurry or maybe in the border of becoming meaningless. And then I went on to think about the question of being accepted, and for kelp maybe it's being accepted as food in Europe or in the North Sea. And for me, the question is maybe being accepted as an artist here, and all this problem that I'll have to deal with this immigration and naturalization office in the Netherlands. This is my day one arriving here. So this relationship between me and kelp kind of intertwined in this script. And the second question is you asked about the problem of ethics in artistic practice, and I think ethics became complex and full of dilemmas when it involves non-humans. For example, we are totally capable of loving animals or loving non-humans in a destructive way. And perhaps I think that even if we have good intentions, we can totally cause a disruption in biosphere or non-humans. So for me, I always try my best to acknowledge my limits, either sensorially or physically or more consciously acknowledge my limits as a human, and while being as humble as I can to listen and think, question and imagine.
Thank you. Yeah, this idea of humility and listening is, I share it with you. I agree with you. It's very important when relating to the non-human, right? And it's also something that probably you experience also in translating the sensibilities of these non-human entities today, right? And presenting them to us with these, with the videos and with the stories you're telling. Okay, so now we move to the last and the youngest, actually, of the three non-human entities. So the third videos.
Put together and send out to the North Sea. From the drawing board to the yard, slowly my body taking shape, metal forged with metal. The engine rooms, the drilling floor, the sleeping quarters, the rec room, the heli deck. Slowly each piece added to the skeleton. Shaped in harbors in Poland, Taiwan, Shanghai. Put together and send out to the North Sea. My true production cycle started at the edge of the northern sector. I'm by nature a nomadic entity, probing for new resources. Each sailing a precious gamble. Towed in position, feet planted on the seabed. My drill penetrates the earth. Tentacles reaching from the drilling floor, horizontal and far below. Devonian, Carboniferous, Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, Paleocene, Eocene. A substance wells to the drilling floor. First oil. A satisfied hum moves through my skeleton. A continuous cycle of exploitation. A well is drilled. A well is inspected. A well is abandoned. A well is forgotten. Repeat. A well is drilled. A well is drilled. A well is inspected. A well is inspected. A well is abandoned. A well is abandoned. A well is forgotten. A well is forgotten. A well is forgotten. During dark and windy days, the roaring surface licks away at my feet. The swaying makes the workers uneasy, a little sick. "12-hour shifts, slumbering zombies, 12 hours of daytime, nighttime, wrapped in a ball of insomnia, click, click, click. My body a home. Moving from sector to sector. Night shifts, darkness, grease, stained coveralls, the smell of petrol exhaustion slipping into bones, the howling of pipes. After 40 years of prosperity, the restless search. I stand with my colleagues on the fringes of the North Sea, assembled in silent graveyards, waiting for better times, slowly petrifying, my legs covered in barnacles, my body turned into rust. My body pulled apart, reshuffled, reused and removed. A gull returns.
Thank you, Tanja. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in this video, I guess, but I'll leave it up to the audience. One question, if you can tell us more about this body at home, and if you visited this space, this specific location we are seeing in the video.
Yeah, let's maybe start with the location. It's in the south of the Netherlands, in Vlissingen, and it's a harbor where they recycle drilling rigs. And past year I've spent a lot of time there filming and wandering around. And I think these places are kind of, they really show what is happening on the North Sea if you think in terms of oil production and gas production. We've been doing this since the 50s, and oil and gas is almost gone, or it is too costly for companies to still looking for new wells. And so slowly they're taking out production platforms and all these oil rigs. Now times have changed a little bit, but a lot of the expenditure for the search for new oil was so expensive. And in the 2000s, they had a late kind of oil boom. So in like 5 or 6 years, there were many new rigs built, and then all of a sudden they stopped exploring. And so on the fringes of the whole North Sea, there are all these places, for example, in Scotland, the Netherlands, where all these rigs are kind of standing, waiting for a new life. And the particular platform that I was filming here, the person who worked there, he actually worked on that platform during its production life. It has been at sea for 40 years. And I think that's also very specific to this industry. When it started in the 50s and 60s, it was all with young men trying to make a lot of money in a very quick succession. And now these men are older and going to pension, and in the same ways, these platforms and drilling rigs are also kind of retiring. But of course, it leaves a lot of questions. What happens to these rigs? The harbor here in Vlissingen, they refurbish them and then they send them back to the coast of Africa. Next door, there's another harbor where they completely demolish platforms. And I think that was also my interest in this North Sea landscape. Because what do you remember? How do you document a landscape that you can't actually see anymore? I think there was a beautiful documentary, for example, about the Piper Alpha accident or disaster, I have to say, in the late 80s. It was a platform that exploded and a lot of people died. And in this documentary, there's a worker who kind of says, like, every time I went back offshore, I could still see this little piece of metal sticking out of the seabed. But at some point, they took it out, and then there's nothing that reminds you anymore of these places. And in a way, these oil rigs and platforms are kind of a home for people, because when they work there, it's very intense. You work there 2 weeks off, 2 weeks on, and 12-hour shifts. You're always together, so they're also a community. People know each other from different rigs because they're all moving from company to company. So for my own practice, it's really interesting to kind of think about how do we document these spaces. And also there's been a cultural shift. When they started in the 50s and 60s, this was really man conquering nature. We were so proud of this era, and now of course we look at it with completely different eyes, and maybe a little bit we're a bit ashamed of what we've been doing there. And of course there are all these questions of what do we leave behind when you decommission a platform or an oil rig moves away. So
Yeah, and I think this is meaningfully captured when you mentioned the well, which is forgotten, right? Explored, investigated, and eventually forgotten.
Unfortunately, that's one of the things that's happening at the North Sea right now, is that they've been drilling so much since the 60s. And in the beginning, they were quite small companies, and they've been sold off to bigger companies. And now Shell and NAM, for example, today, it was a big news that NAM is selling off their smaller fields because they no longer have the money and capacity to take care of them, which means that people have to keep an eye on these fields. But moving from company to company, sometimes they get lost. So governments call companies going, how is it with well 2 in sector this and this? And then companies can't remember that they had them, and then they have to search for them again with sonar boats. And this is actually because we are talking about hundreds of wells. So this is a really big environmental issue for the next decades or even longer. So in the submarine soil, like hundreds wells, which nobody really mapped, or? Well, we hope. That's the question.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we can open the conversation to the audience now. Here.
First, to open up for questions in the room in the Eyck Academie in Amsterdam. I don't know if there are any. Please raise your hand and I will come with the mic. Emily.
Well, first of all, thank you all. It's really nice, especially to see the films and then hear you reflect on them. I'm curious in a way from, I think each one of them, left me thinking about scale, like the kind of micro to macro, and a question about agency in relation to where your agency as an artist, in a way, to enter into these landscapes, let's say. Because I think quite often when you're working with, questions about the environment, there's this feeling of disempowerment and scale, like it's so big, how can anyone act in this picture, let's say. And then the other question I had is also when you were talking, Tanja, about how do you document something that's not there anymore. In a way that's also this question about how do you, in a way, like work in changing conditions in relation to sort of environment, let's say, like how do you capture that, and where do you situate yourself in relation to that? So, well, I think I'd like to hear each of you on that, if that's okay.
I can start. I always felt like that, like it was too big, too difficult for me to interfere with, even though I could see that it's gambling with the ecosystem. And like, for instance, the Odyssey is very much alive and it's very much interconnected. And when I was working here at Rijks, I was working on a sand clock, a big sand timer, and I used nourishment sand from my hometown. And from working with the sand, I noticed that anything, even in a studio, anything that changed the time of the sand, the behavior of the sand. And then I was thinking, why are these narratives so simple if even making a clock in a studio is so difficult? So then I started reading all these papers, and most of them are just ridiculous. Like, you don't even have to feel intimidated by it. And then I thought, okay, anything I can say is better than saying nothing. So now I write all the time. Like, for this last permit, I wrote some official complaints. Like, I think the ecosystem as a whole is not represented in this because the reports separate each entity from the ecosystem from another and calculate the impact, but they also impact each other. And it's not even that difficult to make a complaint, but it's a lot of reading. And also the misinformation about the sand nourishment, that the Wadden Sea is fixing the soil subsidence by itself. I think, okay, it's easy to write a complaint that this is misleading information, simple things like that. And now I don't feel so intimidated anymore, but it is a lot of work. But I think anyone can do it.
Yeah, and I think also in the case of, and I think that's kind of what these videos also show, is that thinking about the environment and for me the future and the history of fossil fuels, it's very big, but once you start unpacking it and then you see it's also so interrelated with each other. I mean, the kelp can't live with the sand, the kelp will be stuck to a rig stands on the sand. And I think for me personally, it really helps to bring it back to one subject and really dive into it and kind of infiltrate into the world, ask a lot of questions, almost like this journalistic approach. I would say I'm less of an activist in a way, but I think it's very important that as an artist you can get some different access and show people places that normally they don't know or they can't access, because why would you be on a drilling rig? The only place, like, you will only be invited there if you work there, or so in that way it's kind of more infiltrating and my work is also like putting little seeds in people's brains about these places, and also that the audience can make up their own minds. I think people are smart enough to understand the context and to make up their own minds.
For me, it's about what perspective people are taking, or we are taking, when looking at these phenomena or incidents with big scale or small scale. I believe that after maybe the Industrial Revolution, maybe people are moving towards science, and people have a belief in science or the products of science. And the belief, unfortunately, is oftentimes unconditional, which I believe is a misunderstanding, because science is not about seeking truth, but science is the transmission of that. So totally believing in science is actually forming a trap in this belief structure where people can go to actually nowhere. So what I think that art and perhaps design and also literature can do is offer another perspective and remind us that science perhaps is the only is only one way to look at things. And yeah, and after all, nowadays in applied science or engineering, science is still more or less human-centric.
Okay, thank you for the question and for the answers. I wonder if there are any more questions in this room, or we can maybe move to Helsinki and invited students there, or Marika, if there are any questions.
Do you hear me there?
Yes.
Hi. Well, let's see if we have any questions here. Any comments? Anybody wants to share or just send to the artist? Thank you.
Unfortunately, couldn't hear the question.
Sorry, there was no question. I just said that I enjoyed the works very much, all three of them, and thank you for showing them to us.
Well, maybe I have just a comment. What I feel as an artist or just public for these works, I felt very strongly this bodily response in each work, and how come this kind of ecological circumstances in contemporary art brings all the facts for me much more real than science, I guess, because there's always a person who is experiencing or even connecting to the history of their own, and this is so valuable that you are working with this different subjects. But if any one of you want to reflect on that, what has happened after these projects were filmed or done, if there's any new continuation. Well, you mentioned some of the things, but if these places are still valid, or do you go and look for like a new places, new ways to see the world? Is it connected to this kind of work in the academies or in residencies, or how come you are going further after one of the work like this you have done? Any one of you could answer if you feel like. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I can, well, I'll answer it for myself, but the offshore industry and the landscape on the North Sea, I've been working on it for the past 4 years, on and off. It started very intense with going on, did a residency, self-initiated residency on a maintenance vessel. And then I made an exhibition in a residency, but the subject always kind of comes back to me, and I left it during my residency at Eyck Academie. The first year I worked on something other, on a toxic waste island, also in the Netherlands. And I kind of came back to the subject because it was still in the news, and I was still kind of reflecting on these places. You meet a lot of people, so I was still in contact with people from the offshore industry. And I feel my next project will also still be about the fossil fuel industry in the Netherlands. I'm thinking about the gas fields in the north of the Netherlands. But I can imagine that in 5 years' time, a lot of it has changed on the North Sea, so I might go back to it and think about how what is happening on the North Sea, because I think that's also kind of important to say in this talk, why we chose the North Sea, because it's a space where a lot is happening right now. It's one of the busiest seas in the world. Wind farms are being pulled up everywhere. In the next couple of years, with climate change, there will be even more boats because they will be sailing across the Arctic, or the North Pole, sorry. And so we need to think, what do we want from the sea, and how can the sea still relate to us if it's becoming busier and busier, and also for non-humans, of course.
Thank you, Marika, for the question. Are there any more in the room, maybe? No? Okay, then I would like to also invite maybe Hisham and Bruno, if there are any questions in Maastricht.
Thank you so much for your presentations, all of you. I really enjoyed it. I have a question to Sheng-Wen. I was just wondering, also in relation to the question that Giulia posed, about sort of bridging towards another species. How one could do that and sort of do that with a certain kind of empathy, and whether this brings out a certain kind of emotion, or you could bridge yourself as a human being towards something that is non-human, whether you could feel the pain of or the emotions of such being. I was just wondering if there's a way to bridge emotionally towards non-human entities.
For me, there's always, or for us as humans, there's always this question of whether or not we can really take the perspective of another species, or of maybe non-humans, or any other entities that is not us. But I think the same question applies for other individuals as well. For example, I also cannot take the perspective of Astrid or Tanja or Giulia or my mother. But I mean, we still try. Like, for example, perhaps when my parent is sick, I still try to imagine how they feel. In a way, I won't excuse myself saying that, oh, I cannot really take the perspective of this of my mother, and I don't need to empathize with my mother. That's of course not what a normal person would do. But for non-humans, I don't know. We tend to form this barrier that that we can not really form this perspective from the non-human side, and sometimes we altogether abandon even trying. And for me, of course, it is impossible to take the perspective of non-humans, but I think it makes a difference whether we try or not, whether trying and not trying at all will make a difference. And we are always, I think, allowed to imagine what it is like to be something else. And I believe that imagination comes before any forms of representation.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I was just wondering whether is this part of your practice? Maybe empathizing with non-human species, or at least thinking about empathy or using empathy as a practice?
I mean, I have been working more on the relationship between animals and humans for the past few years. So empathy can be a role, but it's not the only role in my practice. As I mentioned in a question that Giulia asked, if we empathize non-humans in the wrong way, we can make a destructive decision. That happens to me. In my childhood, I empathize with a hermit crab that I took as a pet. And I thought that the hermit crab would be kind of cold in winter, so I used like a warmer seawater for it. And of course, the hermit crab died the other day. So I was totally saddened, because, and also I felt very stupid of myself, because it is so easy for us to empathize with non-humans. In this case, actually a cold-blooded animal with my own sensorial feelings. And so for me, it is always quite important to stay humble and conscious that, and always remind myself that as humans, I have a lot of limits. And perhaps for me, that is one of the ways to avoid this wrong ways of empathizing.
I was just thinking also of those limits that art practice has always had historically a huge relationship with animals. And also, strangely enough, animals are the first things that children starts to draw, right? I mean, there's sort of this first thing that children have, and this is sort of a relationship with the outside world, and animals seem to be sort of the first things that they do. I was just wondering whether, if you look at art practice and the representation of animals within art practice, whether there could be sort of a new form that we're trying right now, which is trying to even make the bridge, sort of shorter, or to get a different kind of relationship, to try to understand the non-human, because in fact we also need to now, even when there's these limitations. There's sort of an urgency that we do understand what we are doing to our environment, what we are doing to the outside world. I was just wondering whether art practice has evolved or something like that. I mean, where it was before, on the level of representation, such as representation of landscape or whatever. It now goes beyond representation. I don't know if you've ever had a thought about that, and then I'll stop asking questions.
I think it's a very good question, because art can have many different strategies or tactics, and representation perhaps is only one of them. And artists trying to kind of represent the non-humans, or trying to think about the non-humans, eventually I think a myriad of ways can be formed. And for me, when I did my residency at the Eyck Academie, the step I took is I move away from representation to direct experience. So for me, direct experience is something that I resort to in the last 2 years. For instance, I try to hear like a cat. I mean, I build a machine which I can kind of like access the hearing ability of the cat, and I wore the machine for 1 month non-stop to see if I'll go crazy. Wow. So that's one of the direct experience I try to endure during my residencies. And I also built an escape room that allows people to kind of feel what it is like to be an eel living in the Netherlands. So in that case, the direct experience is given back to the audience, and perhaps I think that is an alternative to representation.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't really formulated fully the question in my brain, but while you were presenting and giving voices and translating the messages from these entities to us, I couldn't help but think of a book, and I wanted to read a small quote from that book, and maybe a question can come out of me by the end of that quote. But you might have come across this book from Jane Bennett called Vibrant Matter, and I think it ties beautifully to many of the things that you have enacted to us today. So I quote, "Why advocate the vitality of matter? Because my hunch is that the image of dead or thoroughly instrumentalized matter feeds human hubris and our earth-destroying fantasies of conquest and consumption. It does so by preventing us from detecting, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling a fuller range of the non-human powers circulating around and within human bodies. These material powers, which can aid or destroy, enrich or disable, ennoble or degrade us, in any case, call for our attentiveness or even respect, provided that the term be stretched beyond its Kantian sense." Sorry, it's very, this parenthesis. Continuing. "The figure of an intrinsically inanimate matter may be one of the impediments to the emergence of more ecological and more materially sustainable modes of production and consumption." And now what I find it really interesting, the next paragraph. So, quote again, "Theories of democracy that assume a world of active subject and passive objects begin to appear as thin descriptions at a time when the interactions between human, viral, animal, and technological bodies are becoming more and more intense. If human culture is inextricably enmeshed with vibrant, non-human agencies, and if human intentionality can be agentic only if accompanied by a vast entourage of non-humans, then it seems that the appropriate unit of analysis for democratic theory is neither the individual human nor an exclusively human collective, but the ontologically heterogeneous public coalescing around a problem. End of quote. And for the framing of this lecture, you referred to the Parliament of Things of Bruno Latour, and I was wondering if these entities told you any of their ideas about modes of political discussion and representation, or their wishes to engage with human policies and politics, and in which ways they would imagine their integration in our systems, or the changing of our systems to cater to their voices. So I wonder if you can translate more of those ideas if you indeed discuss them. For everyone, the question is for whoever wants to answer, or maybe no one had the discussion with these entities.
I think Jane Bennett connects quite well with also Hisham's question for Sheng, because it opens up the discourse also towards the inanimate. And actually, it's something that I also wanted to ask you, Astrid and Tanja, about how you relate with what has been exchanged between us, Hisham, like spurring from Hisham's questions about the animal world. Mm-hmm. But how do you relate to it with sand, which is an animate matter, and the infrastructure, which for Jane Bennett, she's a new materialist, and she's also tackling in one of her chapter like the electric grid and the agency of the electric grid in our lives. So really tackling infrastructure as an agent, and as well as, like stones and inanimate matter as agents of our worldlings. So how do you feel about it? How do you feel that the representation methods, humans representing or relating to these entities, to these inanimate entities, can open up new ways for non-anthropocentric views, for a different understanding, which has also political relevance, because the way we understand them, the way we know, is political eventually. It has, the manipulation of corporate narratives, has science, the construction, the social and political construction of science is demonstrating us, and it's becoming more and more relevant now with the ecological crisis. So the way we know the world matters, right? And
yeah, I think it's how do you say, an exercise in empathy and an exercise in well, for me, thinking about the rig, it's also thinking about a place, and then you start to think, where is something situated? And then there's a geographical part of it, but it's also how is it situated in society. And I think that's kind of how you kind of can embody all these entities. If you think, and I think a grain of sand might be a very nice way to put it. When you take some sand from the North Sea and you have it in your hand, you can look at the sand itself. You can take the sand, use a science way to really go, but you could also look at who's actually the hand who's holding the sand. What are these feet where are they standing? So you kind of pull out and you kind of pull in. So for me, the rig is an exercise in we were talking about the macro and the meso. It's zooming in and out, and also thinking about the lives of humans, but also the lives of animals that lived on the rigs. Or there's so many facets that you can bring to the table, and of course. What would a rig think? I think all the rigs are quite sad. They're made to produce and to look, and that's what we people want. And we were also talking about the story of
China Melville.
Yeah, right? And where the oil rigs actually become almost animal presences, and they roam the seas, and they kind of take revenge at people because we made them drill oil and they are kind of taking back what's there. So yeah, I think it's also imagination. How do we can imagine a future for non-humans and humans? There's a bit of a crisis of imagination in a way if you look in how people tackle climate change, and they try to keep making it smaller so it's not that big of a problem. And I think we need a lot more imagination from scientists and from artists, but also from governmental bodies to really imagine a more stable future for ourselves.
Yeah. And I think like this question relates also in terms of sand to something that fascinated me very much of your video, Astrid, which is this alien presence of plastic, right? Mm-hmm. Which might be, so you have the collectivity of sense, so they looking at plastic and how plastic is jeopardizing the work or, the life of these worms. So that's also like, in a way, political, right? If we think about Bruno Latour, the Parliament of Things, right? There is some politicalities in there happening between the sand and the sand. Somehow, we discussed about it. My understanding was like the sand not reacting on it as a sort of way of embracing these alien species, but perhaps it's not the right way. Just sand can't help it. Mm. So then we might intervene as human species. We might have more agency in helping sand and the worms to deal with this alien presence. I don't know, if you want to say something about this.
Yeah. Well, I was also thinking from like how the island community sometimes has a completely opposite view of nature than some people who visit, and I made a bit of an analogy with the plastic, like in terms of talking about the community, and but there is a lot of plastic in sand. I also found a lot when I was filtering sand for the sand clock, and it's very tiny, and it is slowing down the worms, and the worms are about the most important animals there, and there are so many of them. And it's also in terms of representation, I was thinking, okay, what I wrote from the perspective of the sand, I started with 1 grain of sand. It was not possible because it had to be a we, but then still, how much is it? And it's like separating and coming together all the time. So that's a bit fluid, like how much sand is it? But I stick to one specific place because I know what happens to sand there, and then all the labels the sand gets and everything that happens to the sand. But then it's still how I imagine it to be. So it's still a single-minded view, and it's also like the company has a bit of a monopoly on information in terms of research, because they research the nature, they research their own damage, they research the pollution. And that's also a single-minded view, so that's why I wanted to end with this hissing. And I also think that paying close attention to things like this that are not spoken from one mind, but just exist, but really show that this place is living. Like when I go back home and it's a low tide, I really check for the hiss, almost like a heartbeat, to know the place is still alive. And I know also that that hiss is stretching from the Netherlands over the border with Germany, over the border to Denmark. So it's a big area hissing, and the hissing is a collective of air and water and sand and worms. It's the wormholes popping open, but then thousands at the same time sounds like a hiss. I think paying attention to things like these, like they say, we speak for ourselves. It's like the sand cannot really speak for itself without others, and I think that goes for many, many things, but it's hard for us or for a company with a clear goal to imagine. So yeah, I would like to push some attention to these things.
There is also a question online, somewhat practical, from Hannah. Thank you, Hannah, for sending in your question. It's for Tanja. Hannah would like to know how did you get access to the oil platform? And I think in a more practical sense.
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a bit of a strange story, and I still don't really understand how I did get access. When I started researching like 4 years ago, I got in contact with some people really in the industry and kind of learned their language and talked a lot about what the industry is and what it's going through. And then I think after a half year of just talking to people, I was talking to someone from the NAM, and he was kind of questioning like, what do you want? And I was like, I want to see a platform in real life. I want to film them and be there. And weirdly enough, they had this new ship called the Kronborg, and instead of sending people by helicopter to the platforms, they have this big ship, and crew is on there for 2 weeks. And then they told me in the summertime we have there's not so much crew, so we can take you on for 2 weeks. So that was kind of my first visit offshore. And in order to do that, I had to do all these courses, because or else you can't go on the platforms. And luckily the Mondrian Fund funded me some money to do these courses, and that's how I got on the ships. And by going on the ships, you meet a lot of other people. And for example, one of the people I met is Siebe Visser. He's the owner of a drilling rig who's standing here in Amsterdam. And he introduced me to a lot of people. So when I was thinking about filming in Vlissingen, he right away said, oh, I know this and this person, I'll give them a call. And so this, the network kind of continues. And Siebe, for example, has also been a speaker at a symposium where he was kind of, he called himself the dirty man of oil. And so we had like an activist, somebody from the oil industry. And I think that's really interesting when you have all parties there. Yeah, so the network is spreading still.
Cool. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think we have come to an end. And I would like to ask you all for sharing your stories with us and giving us a better insight on how the way you think about things, the way you feel about things, and the way maybe non-humans feel about those things as well. So thank you, Tanja, Astrid, and Sheng, and special thanks to Giulia. And thank you also for the questions in the rooms in Amsterdam, Maastricht, and Helsinki, and online. Thank you for attending this event, and I would also immediately like to invite you to the next event, which will be taking place on November 17 at the Jan van Eyck in Maastricht. It will be again streamed online live at 4 p.m. Central European Time. Thank you so much, and we hope to see you then.